Om Jnanatimirandasya
Om Jnanatimirandasya
Gyananjana Shalakaya
Gyananjana Salakaya
Chakshurunmilitam Yena
Chakshurunmilitam Yena
Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha
Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha
Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam
Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam
Stapitam Yena Bhutale
Stapitam Yena Bhutale
Swayam Rupa Kadamayam
Swayam Rupa Kadamayam
Tadati Swapadantikam
Tadati Swapadantikam
Vandeham Shri Guru
Vandeham Shri Guru
Shri Yuta Padakamalam
Shri Yuta Padakamalam
Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha
Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha
Shri Rupam Sagrajatam
Shri Rupam Sagrajatam
Sagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam
Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam
Sadvetam Savadutam
Sadvetam Savadutam
Harijana Sahitam
Parijana Sahitam
Krishna Chaitanya Devam
Krishna Chaitanya Devam
Shri Radha Krishna Padam
Shri Radha Krishna Param
Sagana Lalita
Sahagana Lalita
Shri Visakanvitamscha
Shri Visakanvitamscha
He Krishna Karuna Sindhu
He Krishna Karuna Sindhu
Dinabandhu Jagapate
Dinabandhu Jagatpate
Gopisha Gopika Kanta
Gopisha Gopika Kanta
Radha Kanta Namostute
Radha Kanta Namostute
Tapta Kanchana Gorange
Tapta Kanchana Gorangi
Radhe Vrindavaneshwari
Radhe Vrindavaneshwari
Vrishabhanu Sute Devi
Vrishabhanu Sute Devi
Pranamami Hari Priye
Pranamami Hari Priye
Vanchakapatarubhyascha
Vanchakalpatarubhyascha
Kripa Sindhavya Evacha
Kripa Sindhu Bhayavacha
Patitanam Pavanebhyo
Patitanam Pavanebhyo
Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha
Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha
Shri Krishna Chaitanya
Shri Krishna Chaitanya
Prabhu Nityananda
Prabhu Nityananda
Shri Advaita Gadadhara
Shri Advaita Gadadhara
Shri Vasari Gaura Bhaktavrinda
Shri Vasari Gaura Bhakta Vrinda
Hare Krishna Hare Krishna
Hare Krishna Hare Krishna
Krishna Krishna Hare Hare
Krishna Krishna Hare Hare
Hare Rama Hare Rama
Hare Rama Hare Rama
Rama Rama Hare Hare
Rama Rama Hare Hare Nama Om Vishnu Padaya
Namo Vishnu Padaya
Krishna Prestaya Bhutale
Krishna Prastaya Bhutale
Srimati Bhaktivedanta
Srimati Bhakti Vedanta
Swamin Iti Namine
Swami Niti Namine
Namaste Saraswati Deve
Namaste Saraswati Devi
Gauravani Pracharine
Gauravani Pracharini
Nirvisesa Sunyavadi
Narsesha Sunyavadi
Paschacha
Paschata
Dejatarine.
Deshatarine.
And we'll just hear something, a little treat to start us off, which we haven't done for a while. A nice little treat is coming here. This is from the Nectar of Instruction, text 5, the purport. And Prabhupada says that Uttama Adhikari, or the highest devotee, is one who is very advanced in devotional service. An Uttama Adhikari is not interested in blaspheming others. His heart is completely clean, and he has attained the realized state of unalloyed Krishna consciousness. According to Srila Rupa Goswami, the association and service of such a Maha Bhagavat, or perfect Vaishnava, are most desirable. Srila Prabhupada ki
Jai.
jai. So we can associate with Srila Prabhupada this evening, and I think Kavi Prabhu has kindly offered to start us off reading chapter 3. So Kavi, if you're happy to begin,
Yeah, sure.
whenever you feel like passing it over, you just give the thumbs up and like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
great.
sure, sounds good.
Hare Krishna.
Chapter 3. A very nice saintly person. There will not be such benefactors of the highest merit Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his devotees have been. The offer of other benefits is only a deception. It is rather a great harm, whereas the benefit done by him and his followers is the trustest and greatest eternal benefit. This benefit is not for one particular country causing mischief to another, but it benefits the whole universe. Abbay's friend Nandranath Mulik was insistent. He wanted Abbay to see Sadhu from Mayapur. Naren and some of his friends had already met the Sadhu at his nearby ashrama on Altadanga Junction Road, and now they wanted Abbay's opinion. Everyone within considered Abbay the leader. So if Naren could tell the others that Abbay also had a high regard for the Sadhu, then that would confirm their own estimations. Abbay was reluctant to go, but Naren pressed him. They stood talking amidst the passerby on the crowded early evening street as the traffic of horse-drawn hackneys, ox carts, and occasional auto taxis and motor buses moved noisily on the road. Naren put his hand firmly around his friend's arm, trying to drag him forward, while Abbay smiled, but stubbornly pulled the other way. Naren argued that since they were only a few blocks away, they should at least pay a short visit. Abbay laughed and asked to be excused. People could see that the two young men were friends, but it was a curious sight. The handsome young man dressed in white gadi kurta and dhoti being pulled along by his friend. Naren explained that the sadhu Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was a Vaishnava and great devotee of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. One of his disciples, a sannyasi, had visited the Mulik house and had invited them to meet Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. A few of Muliks had gone to see him and had been very much impressed. But Abbay remained skeptical. Oh no, I know all these sadhus, he said. I am not going. Abbay had seen many sadhus in his childhood. Every day his father had entertained at least 3 or 4 in his home. Some of them were no more than beggars and even smoked ganja. Guru Mohan had been very liberal in allowing anyone who wore the saffron robes of a sannyasi to come. But did it mean that though a man was no more than a beggar or ganja smoker, he had to be considered saintly just because he dressed as a sannyasi or was collecting funds in the name of building a monastery or could influence people with his speech? No. By and large, they were a disappointing lot. Abbay had even seen a man in his neighborhood who was a beggar by occupation. In the morning, when others dressed in their work clothes and went to their jobs, this man would put on saffron cloth and go out to beg and in the way earn his livelihood. But was it fitting that such so-called sadhu be paid a respectful visit as if he was a guru? Naren argued that he felt that this particular sadhu was a very learned scholar and that Abbay should at least meet him and judge him for himself. Abbay wished that Naren would not behave this way, but finally he could no longer refuse his friend. Together they walked past the Parsnath Jain temple to one Altadanga with its sign. Bhakta Vinod asana, announcing it to be quarters of the Gurudaya Mat. When they arrived at the door, a young man recognized Mr. Mullik. Naren had previously given a donation and immediately escorted them up to the roof of the second floor and into the presence of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who was sitting and enjoying the early evening atmosphere with a few disciples and guests. Sitting with his back very straight, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati appeared tall. He was slender, his arms were long, and his complexion was fair and golden. He wore round bifocals with similar frames, and his nose was sharp, his forehead broad, and his expression was very scholarly, yet not all timid. The vertical markings of Vaishnav Tilka on his forehead were familiar to Abhay, as were simple sannyasi robes that draped over his right shoulder, leaving the other shoulder and half his chest bare. He wore tulsi neck beads, and the clay Vaishnav markings of Tilka were visible at his throat, shoulder, and the upper arms. A clean white Brahminical thread was looped around his neck and draped across his chest. Abhay and Naren, having both been raised in Vaishnava families, immediately offered prostrated obeisances at the sight of the revered sannyasi. Would someone else like to take over? You're on mute, Mantra.
If anyone would like to read, you can go for it. Okay. I'll go for it.
Somebody just unmuted.
Oh, Mahamantra
Mahamantra.
Prabhu.
I don't know. I want to go. Okay. So it's while the two young men were still rising and preparing to sit, before any preliminary formalities of conversation had begun, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta immediately said to them, "You are educated young men. Why don't you preach Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's message throughout the whole world?" Abhay could hardly believe what he had just heard. They had not even exchanged views, yet this sadhu was telling them what they should do. Sitting face to face with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abhay was gathering his wits and trying to gain a comprehensible impression. But this person had already told them to become preachers and go all over the world. Abhay was immediately impressed, but he wasn't going to drop his intelligent skepticism. After all, there were assumptions in what the sadhu had said. Abhay had already announced himself by his dress to be a follower of Gandhi, and he felt the impulse to raise an argument. Yet, as he continued to listen to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta speak, he also began to feel won over by the sadhu's strength of conviction. He could sense that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta didn't care for anything but Lord Chaitanya, and that this was what made him great. This was why followers had gathered around him, and why Abhay himself felt drawn, inspired, and humbled, and wanted to hear more. But he felt obliged to make an argument, to test the truth. Drawn irresistibly into discussion, Abhay spoke up in answer to the words Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had so tersely spoken in the first seconds of their meeting. "Who will hear your Chaitanya's message?" Abhay queried. "We are a dependent country. First, India must become independent. How can we spread Indian culture if we are under British rule?" Abhay had not asked haughtily, just to be provocative, yet his question was clearly a challenge. If you were to take this sadhu's remark to be take them as a serious one, and there was nothing in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's demeanour to indicate that he had not been serious, Abhay felt compelled to question how he could propose such a thing while India was still dependent. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta replied in a quiet, deep voice that Krishna consciousness didn't have to wait for a change in Indian politics, nor was it dependent on who ruled. Krishna consciousness was so important, so exclusively important, that it could not wait. Abhay was struck by his boldness. How could he say such a thing? The whole world of India beyond this little Altadanga rooftop was in turmoil and seemed to support what Abai had said. Many famous leaders of Bengal, many saints, even Gandhi himself, men who were educated and spiritually minded, all might very well have asked this same question, challenging this sadhu's relevancy. And yet he was dismissing everything and everyone as if they were of no consequence. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta continued, whether one power or another ruled was a temporary situation, but the eternal reality is Krishna consciousness, and the real self is the spirit soul. No man-made political system, therefore, could actually help humanity. This was the verdict of the Vedic scriptures and the line of spiritual masters. Although everyone is an eternal servant of God, when one takes himself to be the temporary body and regards the nation of his birth as worshipable, he comes under illusion. The leaders and followers of the world's political movements, including the movements for Swaraj, were simply cultivating this illusion. Real welfare work, whether individual, social, or political, should help prepare a person for his next life and help him re-establish his eternal relationship with the Supreme. Okay, so let's take the baton. Thank you.
Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had articulated these ideas many times before in his writing. There has not been, there will not be such benefactors of the highest merit as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his devotees have been. The offer of other benefits is only a deception. It is rather a great harm, whereas the benefit done by him and his followers is the truest and greatest eternal benefit. This benefit is not for one particular country causing mischief to another, but it benefits the whole universe. The kindness that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has shown to jivas absolves them eternally from all wants, from all inconveniences, and from all the distresses. That kindness does not produce any evil, and the jivas who have it will not be the victims of the evils of the world. As Abai listened attentively to the arguments of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he recalled a Bengali poet who had written that even less advanced civilizations like China and Japan were independent, and yet India labored under political oppression. Abai knew well the philosophy of nationalism, which stressed that Indian independence had to come first. An oppressed people was a reality, the British slaughter of innocent citizens was a reality, and independence would benefit people. Spiritual life was a luxury that could be afforded only after independence. In the present times, the cause of national liberation from the British was the only relevant spiritual movement. The people's cause was in itself God. Yet because Abai had been raised a Vaishnava, he appreciated what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was saying. Abai had already concluded that this was certainly not just another questionable sadhu, and he perceived the truth in what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said. This sadhu wasn't concocting his own philosophy, and he wasn't simply proud or belligerent, even though he spoke in a way that kicked out practically every other philosophy. He was speaking the eternal teachings of the Vedic literature and the sages, and Abai loved to hear it. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, speaking sometimes in English and sometimes in Bengali, and sometimes quoting the Sanskrit verses of the Bhagavad Gita, spoke of Sri Krishna as the highest Vedic authority. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna had declared that a person should give up whatever duty he considers religious and surrender unto him, the personality of Godhead. Sarvadharmam parityaja mam ekam saranam vraja. And the Srimad Bhagavatam confirmed the same thing. Dharma projita kaitavotra paramo nirmat saranam satam. All other forms of religion are impure and should be thrown out, and only Bhagavat Dharma, performing one's duties to please the Supreme Lord, should remain. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's duty to please the Supreme Lord. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's presentation was so cogent that anyone who accepted the Shastras would have to accept his conclusion. The people were now faithless, said Bhaktisiddhanta, and therefore they no longer believed that devotional service could remove all anomalies, even on the political scene. He went on to criticize anyone who was ignorant of the soul and yet claimed to be a leader. He even cited names of contemporary leaders and pointed out their failures, and he emphasized the urgent need to render the highest good to humanity by educating people about the eternal soul and the soul's relation to Krishna and devotional service. Abai had never forgotten the worship of Lord Krishna or his teachings in Bhagavad Gita, and his family had always worshipped Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, whose mission Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was espousing. As these Gaudiya Math people worshipped Krishna, he also had worshipped Krishna throughout his life and had never forgotten Krishna. But now he was astounded to hear the Vaishnava philosophy presented so masterfully. Despite his involvement in college, marriage, the national movement, and other affairs, he had never forgotten Krishna. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was now stirring up within him his original Krishna consciousness. And by the words of this spiritual master, not only was he remembering Krishna, but he felt his Krishna consciousness being enhanced 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times. What had been unspoken in Abai's boyhood, what had been vague in Jagannath Puri, what he had been distracted from at college, what he had been protected in by his father now surged forth within Abai in responsive feelings, and he wanted to keep it. He felt himself defeated, but he liked it. He suddenly realized that he had never before been defeated, but this defeat was not a loss. It was an immense gain. Srila Prabhupada. I was from a Vaishnava family, so I could appreciate what he was preaching. Of course, he was speaking to everyone, but he found something in me, and I was convinced about his argument and mode of presentation. I was so much struck with wonder. I could understand. Here was the proper person who can give a real religious idea. It was late. Abai and Naran had been talking with him for more than 2 hours. One of the brahmacharis gave them each a bit of prasadam in their open palms, and they rose gratefully and took their leave. They walked down the stairs and onto the street. The night was dark. Here and there a light was burning, and there were some open shops. Abai pondered in great satisfaction what he had just heard. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's explanation of the independence movement as a temporary, incomplete cause had made a deep impression on him. He felt himself less a nationalist and more a follower of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He also thought that it would have been better if he were not married. This great personality was asking him to preach. He could have immediately joined, but he was married, and to leave his family would be an injustice. Walking away from the ashram, Naran turned to his friend. So, Abai, what was your impression? What do you think of him? He's wonderful, replied Abai. The message of Lord Chaitanya is in the hands of a very expert person. Srila Prabhupada, I accepted him as my spiritual master immediately. Not officially, but in my heart. I was thinking that I had met a very nice, saintly person.
After his first meeting with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abai began to associate more with the Gaudiya Math devotees. They gave him books and told him the history of their spiritual master. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was one of 10 children born to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, a great Vaishnava teacher in the disciplic line from Lord Chaitanya himself. Before the time of Bhaktivinoda, the teachings of Lord Chaitanya had been obscured by teachers and sects falsely claiming to be followers of Lord Chaitanya, but deviating in various drastic ways from his pure teachings. The good reputation of Vaishnavism had been compromised. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, however, through his prolific writings and through his social position as a high government officer, re-established the respectability of Vaishnavism. He preached that the teachings of Lord Chaitanya were the highest form of theism and were intended not for a particular sect or religion or nation, but for all the people of the world. He prophesied that Lord Chaitanya's teachings would go worldwide, and he yearned for it. The religion preached by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is universal and not exclusive. The principle of Kirtan as the future church of the world invites all classes of men, without distinction of caste or clan, to the highest cultivation of the spirit. This church, it appears, will extend all over the world and take the place of all sectarian churches which exclude outsiders from the precincts of the mosque, church, or temple. Lord Chaitanya did not advent himself to liberate only a few men of India. Rather, his main objective was to emancipate all living entities of all countries throughout the entire universe and preach the eternal religion. Lord Chaitanya says in the Chaitanya Bhagavat, "In every town, country, and village, my name will be sung." There is no doubt that this unquestionable order will come to pass. Although there is still no pure society of Vaishnavas to be had, yet Lord Chaitanya's prophetic words will in a few days come true, I am sure. Why not? Nothing is absolutely pure in the beginning. From imperfection, purity will come about. Oh, for that day when the fortunate English, French, Russian, German, and American people will take up banners, mridangas, and cartels and raise kirtan through their streets and towns. When will that day come? As a prominent magistrate, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was a responsible government officer. He served also as superintendent of the temple of Lord Jagannath and was the father of 10 children. Yet in spite of these responsibilities, he served the cause of Krishna with prodigious energy. After coming home from his office in the evening, taking his meals and going to bed, he would sleep from 8 until midnight, and then get up and write until morning. He wrote more than 100 books during his life, many of them in English. One of his important contributions, with the cooperation of Jagannath Das Babaji and Gorakishore Das Babaji, was to locate the exact birthplace of Lord Chaitanya in Mayapur, about 60 miles north of Calcutta. While working to reform Gaudiya Vaishnavism in India, he prayed to Lord Chaitanya, "Your teachings have been much depreciated. It is not in my power to restore them." And he prayed for a son to help him in his preaching. When, on February 6, 1874, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was born to Bhaktivinoda Thakur in Jagannath Puri, the Vaishnavas considered him the answer to his father's prayers. He was born with the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck and draped across his chest like the sacred thread worn by Brahmanas. His parents gave him the name Bimala Prasad. When Bimala Prasad was 6 months old, the carts of Jagannath festival stopped at the gate of Bhaktivinoda's residence and for 3 days could not be moved. Bhaktivinoda Thakur's wife brought the infant into the cart and approached the deity of Lord Jagannath. Spontaneously, the infant extended his arms and touched the feet of Lord Jagannath and was immediately blessed with a garland that fell from the body of the Lord. When Bhaktivinoda Thakur learned that the Lord's garland had fallen onto his son, he realized that this was the son for whom he had prayed. One day, when Bimala Prasad was still a child, of no more than 4 years, his father mildly rebuked him for eating mango not yet duly offered to Lord Krishna. Bimala Prasad, although only a child, considered himself an offender to the Lord and vowed never to eat mangoes again. This was a vow that he would follow through his life. By the time Bimala Prasad was 7 years old, he had memorized the entire Bhagavad Gita and could even explain its verses. His father then began training him in proofreading and printing in conjunction with the publishing of the Vaishnav magazine, Sajjana Toshani. With his father, he visited many holy places and heard discourses from the learned Pandits. As a student, Bimala Prasad preferred to read the books written by his father instead of the school texts. By the time he was 25, he had become well versed in Sanskrit, mathematics, and astronomy, and he had established himself as the author and publisher of many magazine articles and one book, Surya Siddhanta, for which he received the epithet Siddhanta Saraswati in recognition of his erudition. When he was 26, his father guided him to take initiation from a renounced Vaishnava saint, Gaurkishore Das Babaji, who advised him to preach the absolute truth and keep aside all other works. Receiving the blessing of Gaurkishore Das Babaji, Bimala Prasad, now Siddhanta Saraswati, resolved to dedicate his body, mind, and words to the service of Lord Krishna. In 1905, Siddhanta Saraswati took a vow to chant the Hare Krishna mantra 1 billion times. Residing in Mayapur, in a grass hut near the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya, he chanted the Hare Krishna mantra day and night. He cooked rice once a day in an earthen pot and ate nothing more. He slept on the ground, and when the rainwater leaked through the grass ceiling, he sat underneath an umbrella chanting. In 1911, while his aging father was lying ill, Siddhanta Saraswati took up a challenge against pseudo-Vaishnavas who claimed that birth in their caste was the prerequisite for preaching Krishna consciousness. The caste-conscious Brahmana community had become incensed by Bhaktivinoda Thakur's presentation of many scriptural proofs that anyone, regardless of birth, could become a Brahmana Vaishnava. These smarta Brahmanas, out to prove the inferiority of the Vaishnavas, arranged a discussion. On behalf of his indisposed father, young Siddhanta Saraswati wrote an essay, The Conclusive Difference Between the Brahmana and the Vaishnava, and submitted it before his father. Despite his poor health, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was elated to hear the arguments that would soundly defeat the challenge of the smartas.
Siddhanta Saraswati then travelled to Midnapur, where pundits from all over India had gathered for a 3-day discussion. Some of the smarta pundits who spoke first claimed that anyone born in a Sudra family, even though initiated by a spiritual master, could never become purified and perform the Brahminical duties of worshipping the deity or initiating disciples. Finally, Siddhanta Saraswati delivered his speech. He began quoting Vedic references glorifying the Brahmanas, and at this the smarta scholars became very much pleased. But when he began discussing the actual qualifications of becoming a Brahmana, the qualities of the Vaishnavas, the relationship between the two, and who, according to the Vedic literature, is qualified to become a spiritual master and initiate disciples, then the joy of the Vaishnava haters disappeared. Siddhanta Saraswati conclusively proved from the scriptures that if one is born as a Sudra but exhibits the qualities of a Brahmana, then he should be honored as a Brahmana despite his birth. And if one is born in a Brahmana family but acts like a Sudra, then he is not a Brahmana. After his speech, Siddhanta Saraswati was congratulated by the president of the conference, and thousands thronged around him. It was a victory for Vaishnavism. With the passing away of his father in 1914 and his spiritual master in 1915, Siddhanta Saraswati continued the mission of Lord Chaitanya. He assumed editorship of Sajjana Tashani and established the Bhagwat Press in Krishna Nagar. Then in 1918, in Mayapur, he sat down before a picture of Gaurkishore Das Babaji and initiated himself into the sannyas order. At this time, he assumed the sannyas title Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was dedicated to using the printing press as the best medium for large-scale distribution of Krishna consciousness. He thought of the printing press as a brihat mridanga, a big mridanga. Although the mridanga drum had traditionally been used to accompany kirtan, even during the time of Lord Chaitanya, and although the Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati himself led kirtan parties and sent groups of devotees chanting in the streets and playing on the mridangas. Such kirtans could be heard only for a block or two. But with the Brihat Mridanga, the big mridanga drum of the printing press, the message of Lord Chaitanya could be spread all over the world. Most of the literature Abai had began reading had been printed on the Bhagwat press, which Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had established in 1915. The Bhagwat press had printed the Caitanya Charitamrita with commentary by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the Bhagavad Gita with commentary by Vishwanath Chakravarti, and one after another the works of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. This literature was the spiritual heritage coming from Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who had appeared almost 500 years before. Abai had been a devotee of Lord Chaitanya since childhood, and he was familiar with the life of Lord Chaitanya through the well-known scriptures Caitanya Charitamrita and Chaitanya Bhagavat. He had learned of Lord Chaitanya not only as the most ecstatic form of a pure devotee who had spread the chanting of the holy name to all parts of India, but also as the direct appearance of Sri Krishna himself in the form of Radha and Krishna combined. But now, for the first time, Abai was in touch with the great wealth of literature compiled by the Lord's immediate associates and followers, passed down in disciplic succession, and expanded on by great authorities. Lord Chaitanya's immediate followers, Srila Rupa Goswami, Srila Sanatana Goswami, Srila Jiva Goswami, and others, had compiled many volumes based on the Vedic scriptures, and proving conclusively that Lord Chaitanya's teachings were the essence of Vedic wisdom. There were many books not yet published, but Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was intent on establishing many presses, just to release the sound of the Brihat Mridanga for the benefit of all people. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was teaching the conclusion of Lord Chaitanya's teachings, that Lord Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and that the chanting of his holy name should be stressed above all other religious practices. In former ages, other methods of attaining to God have been available, but in the present age of Kali, only the chanting of Hare Krishna would be effective. On the authority of the scriptures, such as Brihan Naradiya Purana and the Upanishads, Bhaktivinoda Thakur had specifically cited the Mahamantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Lord Krishna himself had confirmed in Bhagavad Gita that the only method of attaining him was devotional service. Abandon all varieties of religion and just surrender unto me. I shall deliver you from all sinful reactions. Do not fear. Abai knew these verses, he knew the chanting, and he knew the conclusions of the Gita. But now, as he eagerly read the writings of the great acharyas, he had fresh realizations on the scope of Lord Chaitanya's mission. Now he was discovering the depth of his own Vaishnava heritage and its efficacy for bringing about the highest welfare for people in an age destined to be full of trouble.
Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was often travelling, and Abai was busy with his family and business, so to arrange another meeting was not possible. Yet, from their first encounter, Abai had considered Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati his spiritual master, and Abai began thinking of him always. I have met such a nice, saintly person. Whenever possible, Abai would seek out Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's disciples, the members of the Gaudiya Math. As for Gandhi's movement, Gandhi had suffered a bitter setback when his non-violent followers had blundered and committed violence during a protest. The British had taken the opportunity to arrest Gandhi and sentence him to 6 years in jail. Although his followers still revered him, the nationalist movement had lost much of its impetus. But regardless of that, Abai was no longer interested. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had defeated his idea that the nationalist cause was India's first priority. He had invoked Abai's original Krishna consciousness, and Abai now felt confident that Bhaktisiddhanta's mission was the real priority. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had invited him to preach, and from that moment, Abhay wanted to join the Gaudiya Mat as one of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's disciples. But now, instead of his political inclinations, it was his family obligations that stood in the way. He was no longer thinking, first let us become an independent nation, then preach about Lord Chaitanya. Now he was thinking, I cannot take part like the others. I have my family responsibilities. And the family was growing. In 1921, Abhay and his wife had their first child, a son, and there would be more children and more income would be needed. Earning money meant sacrificing time and energy, and it meant, at least externally, being distracted from the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. Indian culture had the highest regard for the family institution, and divorce was unheard of. Even if a man was in great financial difficulty, he would remain with his wife and children. Although Abhay expressed regret at not being a sannyasi disciple in the Gaudiya Mat, he never seriously considered leaving his young wife so early in their marriage. Gaur Mohan was pleased to hear of his son's attraction to a Vaishnav guru, but he never expected Abhay to abandon responsibilities and enter the renounced order. A Vaishnav could remain with his wife and family, practice spiritual life at home, and even become active in preaching. Abhay would have to find ways to serve the mission of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati as a family man. Abhay thought that if he were to become very successful in business, then he could spend money not only to support his family, but also to help support Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's mission of spreading Krishna consciousness. An astrologer had even predicted that Abhay would become one of the wealthiest men in India. But with his present income, he could do little more than provide for his family's needs. He thought he might do better by trying to develop a business on his own. Abhay expressed his feelings to Dr. Bose, who listened like a sympathetic father, and suggested that Abhay become his agent for all of North India. Abhay could purchase medicines, liniments, rectified spirits, toothpastes, and other items wholesale from Dr. Bose's factory and travel widely throughout northern India, building up his own business. Also, Abhay had enough experience with Bose's laboratory that he could try to make and market some of his own medicines and products. Dr. Bose and Abhay decided that the centrally located city of Allahabad would be a good place for Abhay to make his headquarters.
Okay, Hare Krishna. We'll leave it there. I don't know if anybody has any comments or reflections or anything they'd like to share. Please go for it.
Hi, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Sorry, I couldn't help you by reading along. My charger was going on and off, and I wasn't really reading along most of the time. I was just listening. So sorry about that. I will another time.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I enjoyed this. We were talking the other week about how he seemed to have lost his way a little bit, and not quite know what he was doing. But it seems that immediately when he met his guru, he was completely put on track. It was almost like an immediate effect, and it was lovely, that explanation in the book, the way it explained the meeting and the effect it had on him. Yeah, it's fascinating how that happens with the guru, the grace of having a guru to bring that life mission just into so much. Just for him to remember it, really. I suppose it's a remembering of the soul, isn't it? And the connection there. So yeah, I found that fascinating that he just became back on track immediately.
Hare Krishna. Yeah, I thought that bit's really jumped out for me as well. Yeah, that it's like when we were reading the introduction to Bhagavad Gita recently. We were talking about how you have this direct relationship with Krishna, but that relationship goes through the guru. So like when you charge your computer, the electric current goes straight from the plug socket to the computer, but it goes via the cable, the charging cable. So it kind of feels like that, like there's all these different bits of the puzzle have been kind of put into place, like, you know, like his dad being brought up by his dad, and he's got this attraction for like Ratha Yatra and, you know, all these different things. And then, you know, he's had this kind of more like worldly experience, you know, he knows how the world works and whatever, and he's kind of had a look around. But actually when he meets this guru, it just suddenly, everything seems to spark into life. And that is a really powerful thing. When that, it's actually, when it's not, it's partly the guru, but it's also the disciple, the extent to which the disciple's prepared to kind of accept and surrender to the guru's instructions. That's the extent to which that spark kind of takes off. So he's, you know, when he becomes that inspired, and especially when he's living outside, in one sense, kind of outside of the group, like his guru has this institution, the Gaudiya Math, and everybody in it really is like, they're like monks, and, you know, like he's not, I think it becomes more clear later, but you can sort of see it in what we've read. He's kind of a little bit on the outside of everything, which actually benefits him in the end, you know, it actually works well. But to have that level of inspiration and reciprocation with his spiritual master, it's amazing actually to see.
To be so immediate.
Yeah, incredible.
Fantastic, great. It just gets more exciting as you read through it. It's like, yeah, so sweet. Yeah, so sweet. Yeah. Great. I also thought, I think this will happen every time you read it, but there's always these parallels between what Prabhupada, what he's going through in the beginning, then what he goes through later, and what happens, and what we go through now. It's kind of like this eternal sort of, it seems to be the way the material world works, certainly at least in Kali Yuga, but talks about all these different gurus, you know, the people that are smoking, and his guru speaks very strongly about it as well. But that's kind of something that Prabhupada then comes up against later on. Well, he doesn't come up against it, but I think he experiences it later on when he goes to America. There's all these other Indian sort of gurus go as well, and a lot of them are frauds, you know, they're not really the real deal. So it's really interesting, like watching that, and then, you know, and thinking, oh yeah, actually later on that's going to come up. And then you also think about, well, you know, anyone can go on YouTube now and, you know, just hear anything from anybody, but how much of it is actually bona fide? You know? So it's quite interesting to see that play out and think, well, actually it's everything Prabhupada goes through, it's so relevant now. Really amazing. Yeah, there's none of it that feels like archaic. It's just a history lesson. It's like, it's really alive with Krishna consciousness.
Yeah, I liked the part where I was talking about Bhaktivinoda Thakur was praying, when will the French and the Russians and the English and the Americans take banners and mridangas and cartels and go chanting on the streets? And now it's happening. It's happening now. People do go chanting on the streets in cities and towns all across the globe.
Yeah. I don't know if it's the same quote, but I think he mentions English, French, Russian, German, and American here.
Yeah.
And I think there's another quote where he talks about them going to Mayapur and chanting in the holy place of Mayapur. And at one point, a group from each, they somehow arranged a group from each nationality to go there for the pleasure of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, to fulfill that prophecy or that desire of his to do it. So they got, I saw some pictures, there was like a group of them, you know, like that, and they were doing this kirtan, those different nationalities, yeah. But this, yeah, that paragraph that we read that quoted him is really powerful. It talks about the future church, is it? Yeah, the future church of the world. The principle of kirtan as the future church of the world invites all classes of men, without distinction of caste or clan, to the highest cultivation of the spirit. This church, it appears, will extend all over the world and take the place of all sectarian churches, which exclude outsiders from the precincts of the mosque, church, or temple. So you see that happening now. That's a really, I love that sense, you know, it's like so powerful, right? That actually kirtan will be the future church, because everyone can do it. And this sectarianism, it won't hold up. Yeah. And then you watch it happening and you think, oh my goodness, this is incredible. There are people from all different walks of life coming together under this kirtan. And actually what's happening is most of the religions, kind of like the big religions, are fighting, they argue, they disagree, you know, like that. There's so much, you know, bogged down in so much institutionalism and whatever, sectarianism. And then the kirtan just spreads like wildfire. It's amazing. And actually, that was one of the other things that jumped out, was that, which I'd never really considered before. But from reading that, it seems like even when Prabhupada was in India, even when he was in India, this wasn't a big thing, you know? Like, okay, he brought it to America, and that, you think, well, that's incredible. But he actually picked it up when he got hold of it, so to speak, and kind of came into contact with it. It wasn't like a big deal in India, you know? It was, because they're the only ones printing the books, right? You know, that these books are still kind of like underground and, I guess, obscure. So the only people printing them is Bhaktisiddhanta's press. So Prabhupada gets hold of these things, that it's so even, and then to have such a deep faith and conviction, you know, when all around you is not thinking that way, that's quite special. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I don't know if anybody else has anything they wanted to share.
Just one more thing. It all comes down to the fact of finding a spiritual master, but who's like self-realized and who's genuine, you know, because like through these texts, through the Gita, through the Bhagavatam, which we've all been reading during the year, it just keeps like, it's emphasizing that point all the time. And like thinking about from my own memories, it's like when I went to the Kumbh Mela last year in Allahabad, you see all these swamis in these robes, and similar context to Abe, which I was experiencing. I was like, there's so many of them, but it all comes down to finding the actual one, the bona fide spiritual master, I guess.
Yeah, that's probably the message. Actually, I think Kavi's really nailed it. That's the message that's just screaming out of this chapter. Yeah. Is the authenticity of it. Yeah.
Yeah, finding the right spiritual teacher.
Yeah, and then also being a bona fide disciple as well.
Yeah. It's like it's both sides, pure.
Yeah. He was. There's one pastime where, even though Prabhupada, who wasn't Prabhupada, called Prabhupada then obviously, but he went to the what am I trying to say? Vyas Puja. He went to the celebration of his guru's birthday, like appearance day, and he'd written a poem. And he talks about from impersonal calamity thou hast saved, and he has these, and it's quite a famous poem that Prabhupada wrote, quite well known. but he read this poem out, and he was a kind of like relatively obscure but well loved out, kind of like not outside, like a kind of fringe kind of member of the organisation.
Yeah, person in the community.
Yeah, he was like a kind of fringy person who everyone really loved, but and you know, and he was a householder and whatever, and he read out this poem, and everybody just was like really blown away that he'd really understood and was able to concisely and powerfully communicate the mission of his guru. He basically understood his guru's heart completely, and that poem, he communicated it through that poem, and they sent the poem to Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He said immediately publish it, and anything that he writes, I think in English, but anything that he writes, publish it also. You don't have to bring it to me or whatever, proof or anything like that. You don't have to scrutinize it, you just publish it. So yeah, you have that thing, a bona fide guru, and then a disciple who's so surrendered like that, and they understand each other.
It also just shows how deep that type of relationship is, because he's only met him once.
Yeah.
Just one meeting, and he's just ready to dedicate. You know, what is it? He's making his heart one with his guru's heart, and just from one meeting. So it just goes to show that it's so much more than just being physically in the same space. It transcends that. It's by their instruction.
And there was something that didn't happen with Gandhi or anyone else. Like he was doing it with Gandhi, you know, and he was wearing the khadi and stuff, but you know, he hadn't really, like, he wasn't sold out on it. He'd never really forgotten Krishna. He had this niggling, you know, like if someone's in a relationship and they can still think of their ex, you know, and they're like, oh, but you never really committed to the relationship. He's like always, you know, but when he meets his guru, it's just like so clear and powerful. Bhaktisiddhanta was well known for being incredibly impressive individual.
The lion guru.
He just went around, he did not tolerate like Mayavada, impersonalists, people who were not following properly, people, you know, and not amongst his disciples, amongst his own disciples, he was very, obviously, you know, loving and soft, but in the wider sort of like spiritual or religious community, people that posed as leaders or religionists or scholars or whatever, but who were fake, that's what I mean. He just tore them apart. So very, big personality, very big personality. I mean, when you look at them in that context as well, you think, wow, this is like, in one sense, it feels quite homely. The Prabhupada with his friends, and his friend took him to see, you know, a guru. But in the kind of grand cosmic scheme of it, this is like two real, you know, that connection of that lineage is being made, you know. It's like a really big, there's a big arrangement going on there. It's not a small thing.
It means everything to us. Otherwise we wouldn't be here.
Prabhupada gets plugged into the parampara. And then he plugs everyone else in like that. It's quite amazing. Right. Hare Krishna. So I think that's it. Brilliant. We'll pick it up next week, and great. We'll see everyone. Maybe what day is it? Tuesday.
So we'll be on Facebook.
We'll be on Facebook tomorrow for Isha Panishad if anyone wants to join in. Fantastic. Great. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Srila Prabhupada ki.
Ciao.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare